Hey, what's up everybody? Alex here from MetaMind Music. In today's video, I want to go about showing you a great strategy for starting out a song idea or developing a song idea into fruition into your DAW. But before we jump in, I want to offer you my free 7-step workflow wizardry PDF. It's a simple framework that'll guide you from your very first musical ideas all the way to a finished product. Super handy to have around your studio. You can download it at metamindmusic.com/workflow, or you'll find it in the description below. And funny enough, the first step in that workflow process that you'll see is what I want to go over today, which is basically you want to be designing sounds and finding expressive instruments to express yourself towards the vision of a song you're wanting to create, right? So the first step for me for this song was to kind of decide what kind of vibe am I going for, right? And at the time I was listening to like a lot of Spangle, Ott, Desert Dwellers, and I wanted to try my hand at producing like an electronic dance track that has a little bit of like tribal influence in there. So that was kind of what I had in the back of my mind while designing these sounds. And beyond that, designing these sounds in advance and allowing and injecting more modes of expressiveness into the sounds and playing them, getting all that set up in advance will really help you dissolve into flow state and start coming up with ideas and jamming out rhythms and melodies and just all sorts of different ideas without having to go back and menu dive through presets or try to find a sound that makes sense because you did that work ahead of time. And I've been doing this workflow for a while and it works tremendously well. And at the end of it, after you jam out some ideas, then you have a lot of material to work with to then add loops or samples or different instruments on top of it. And you have a solid foundation to start working with to compose a track. All right. So let's jump into here and I'll show you a little bit of what I had set up before I started jamming out these ideas. But before we get started, I'll just give you a little taste of the track. All right, so you get kind of an idea of what I was going for. And the beautiful thing about this track is most of these ideas came from me jamming out on my controller. And I encourage you to develop a workflow that helps you do that because you come up with stuff you would have never thought of programming with a mouse and keyboard. Like I would have never come up with most of these ideas if I hadn't set this up in advance. So let's jump into what I kind of had going to create all these sounds, right? To have a jam session to express myself this way. And I have my session laid out in a familiar way for me, where bass is red, drums are orange, and kind of going up the ladder for what I what I felt suited this track. And inside each of these master groups, I have different instruments. So for example, in my bass group, I have multiple different bass instruments or bass loops or samples that I will use to do varying degrees of bass work in the song, right? So if I jump into this wavetable, for example, before I even started jamming, I hopped into Wavetable, which is a synthesizer in Ableton, and I decided to start designing a sound. And more importantly than designing a sound is I decided to attach various features of the synthesized sound to my hardware controller to express myself even deeper. And this is kind of a secret sauce to get more expressiveness out of your tracks and jamming them into existence, as opposed to having to edit all of these variations and expressiveness elements afterwards, right? It's a huge thing. So let's dive into Wavetable here. And I've got kind of this this kind of bass sound. Let's go down an octave. So it's got a glide on it. It's kind of velocity sensitive, meaning if I hit it lighter or harder, it'll make a different sound. Right? Depending how hard I hit the pad, you can notice that the wave table, which is this first wave section, depending how hard I hit it, the wave table actually goes to a different position and alters the tone of the sound a little bit. I've also attached, if you see the filter frequency in the bottom left corner here, I've attached that frequency to a physical knob, right? So if you're playing now, just in hitting the pads in different amounts of strength and playing with this filter knob, you already get a lot of tonal variation, right, as you're playing. And beyond that, I've attached the filter resonance, which is basically the peak of the filter, which when you raise that and then move the filter frequency, it really accentuates that. And I've also attached another knob to LFO2, which you can see in this area of the screen. And this is basically oscillating LFO that is affecting the position of my second wavetable, right? And the second wavetable is just another layer of this sound. And as I adjust this LFO frequency, you'll actually hear the difference, right? It becomes a lot more audible when it's higher and a lot more subtle when it's lower, right? And you can adjust this as you're playing. Right? So it's just getting that kind of expressiveness and dynamic into an instrument, right? That you can play with your hands, because now you get a physical connection with what you're doing in these electronic worlds, right? You get to express yourself in a way similar to how a musician would express themselves on an instrument, but you basically have infinite possibility and you're creating your own instruments. So that's just one example that I did for bass in this sub. So it's just a simple frequency, sub frequency, but it's the same thing, right? I've just attached various parameters to different encoders on my push controller, but this can work with any controller. And the key is just you have many different ways to express yourself within one instrument, right? So you can really cover a wide palette of sounds and a wide palette of expressive elements right away with your instrument without having to go in and program all these things afterwards. And it has a real-time feedback value, right? It really helps you express yourself through these new instruments and through these different means in a very like physical and embodied way to your inner musician, so to speak. So let's move to, I'll close this bass tab. Let's move into the drums tab, which I have a few different instruments that add up to a drum kit. And I think this one was a preset that I found that really fit the song. So I didn't do too much other than adding a drum bus and some reverb. But one other interesting thing I did is on the sends. So I'm going to switch to my other controller here. Give me a sec. And sends. Whoop, 1 second. Send 2. So now on my controller here, if you can see on the screen, it's adjusting the send to my delay that I've loaded of whatever track I have selected, right? So if I'm selecting the drums, I'm adjusting that send frequency. If I jump to the bass, now I'm adjusting the send for the bass, right? So I have different knobs for all these different tracks depending on where I am, right? So for example, with this drum kit, let's say we have a jam, right? But I could add the delay to it as I'm jamming. So just little variations like that allows you to really add effects as you're playing, right? And it really changes the way you'll play if you're interacting with effects at the same time, right? So that's just another trick that you can use in setting up your sessions to then express yourself deeper when you're coming up with ideas, right? Instead of struggling to find ideas, you're just right away touching stuff, kind of like a child would be, right? Super curious and playing with knobs and it's making different sounds. That's the energy you want to tap into when you're generating ideas, right? Is that just pure, pure curious and excited expressiveness that you have inside yourself, and just tap into that. So I usually have another track for just kick, but I didn't really load anything on it yet. I have an old school kit, which was another kit that I thought fit the sound, but I haven't done too much other different than that. This is interesting. I set up a drum kit that, if you can see here, I've mapped it out in a way that you can alternate your hands, similar to how a drummer would drum on a real drum kit, and in alternating your hands and having a mirror image of the same sample. So if you can see, these are my hi-hats, these are closed hi-hats, kicks, snare, right? And toms, and these are all a mirror image, a symmetrical image of each other. And in doing this, you can do a lot of cool rolls, right? Right? And it's really intuitive to play. Once you familiarize yourself with that and play around with it, it becomes a lot easier to program beats like this than playing that with or clicking that in with a mouse and your keyboard, right? And if you're still getting used to playing rhythms or drumming, no problems. You can always edit it later. But the thing is, at least you have something to work with that was generated from kind of a natural rhythmic expression of yourself, as opposed to over analyzing it and trying to think about it too much. You're just kind of expressing yourself, right? And that's the whole idea behind this, is that you want to be expressing yourself as an artist, as a musician, right? You don't want to be programming music. I don't find that very inspiring. And you can usually tell the difference between music that was really created inside a DAW from an analytical point of view, with clicks and like just analyzing it and thinking about it, as opposed to somebody who played parts and might have edited their performance towards perfection afterwards, but there's still some sort of organic, like unquantifiable essence when you're expressing yourself through your instruments, right? When you're expressing yourself in a physical way, I feel like I can always tell when there's a little bit of that going on. So beyond that, what I do here, I basically loaded a bunch of percussive samples that I thought kind of fit this track. And then I attached an arpeggiator in front to just randomly trigger these samples. So this is basically just like a hack to be creating random glitch noises, right? So if I play this thing, it's basically triggering various samples that I've loaded into it at random with an arpeggiator, right? And if I hit different pads on my push controller, it triggers a different rhythmic sequence. But beyond that, I've decided to add the rate of playback of the arpeggiator onto a rotary encoder here, right? So I have 8th notes, 16th notes, triplet feel, all these different things that I can access just from the turn of a knob. And I also attached a transpose, which effectively changes the pitch of whatever samples are being played back in real time, right? So just with those three simple controllers, I've also attached the velocity decay, which is really more apparent when you have a really high transposition value. Really changes like the decay essence of that amplitude envelope, which sounds super nerdy and hilarious. But just with those three controls, you can really start generating a lot of rhythmic ideas or just some ear candy to get started, right? Instead of having to go in your transpose menu here, let me switch views. Instead of having to go in here and manually put in a bunch of edits of little blips and clicks and random stuff, you can literally start generating ideas with this, and then you have a bunch of content to work with to then edit afterwards, which is a lot easier to then keep the ball rolling and keep your momentum up as opposed to, you know, trying to get one of these things manually dragged into your timeline, right? You're creating sample generators, right, and variation generators and instruments, right, that you can express yourself with. And I can't hammer this enough. Is like this is the foundational work that will allow you to complete a song a lot easier without struggling to be looking for ideas and looking for inspiration when you have a lot of instruments that you've dialed in a way that you can express yourself, that ideas come very quickly, right? And this song is a perfect example of that. Is just all these ideas kind of came about just from jamming with these different instruments together and playing with knobs, and then a bunch of cool things happened, and then I started that as the foundation of building this song out. And this is another great example of utilizing an instrument. Basically, I've loaded a sample with, I think it's a tabla and rhythmic sample loop, and I've decided to attach different pads to different parts of the loop, right? And in doing that, I kind of get like a hack into a real tabla player by triggering this sample, right? And it really fit the vibe of the track. All right, so moving on with the melody, the similar idea, right? I mapped out a synth with a few parameters that I can change in here. Same with operator. I think this was a preset that I really thought fit the sound, right? So you can do this with presets as well if you're not super comfortable with sound design yet, or it seems like super strange and unfamiliar to you. You can just pick sounds that you like, right? And then you can effectively just map any of these parameters that you want to play with a knob. And from there you can then play around with presets and you can change the sounds of them, and it's a good starting point if you're just getting started with this kind of stuff. And that's pretty much the foundation, right? You just keep doing this with all of the layers of sounds that you think that you might be using, right? And the more effort you put into this step, I can't stress this enough, the more effort you put into this first step of really establishing a sonic palette, a vision, like a goal for your song, and put in the work to really dial in the sounds, tuning your instruments, you know? It's like similar to if you're going to record a guitar, right? You want to change your strings, change the intonation, make sure that everything sounds great, you know, test it out before you start recording and before you start coming up with ideas, so that your instrument remains in tune and you can express yourself most effectively to it. And the better you do this step, the easier every subsequent step will become, right? You'll have an easier time flowing and coming up with ideas like I've done here. All these different clips are different loop ideas and jams that I've done. And from there, it'll be a lot easier to hop over to the arrange window and start taking some of these loop ideas and changing them and cutting them up like I've done here, and adding variation to then start composing a song. And then once your song is composed, you can then edit it and add mixing elements and sends and changing transitions to make it more interesting. And then from there, the mix and master will almost do themselves. You know, it's just about getting that last 10% to get maximum sonic impact. And I haven't gotten there yet in this song, but the whole point is that if you follow this workflow process and you put in your maximum effort each time, you'll get a great end result if you focus on each step 100% of your effort. You know what I mean? And the better you complete each step, the more you do this, the more familiar you get with it, and the more you'll find your kind of mojo, your secret sauce in which things work. So that's all I have for you today, and I'll just show you this cool last sitar thing that I had. This is what actually started the song. Is I'm like, okay, I like sitars and I want to play with a sitar, so I loaded a sitar sample into Simpler here in Ableton, and I mapped out these different cuts. So every time I hit a pad here, it's triggering a different part of the sample, and so then I use this as kind of a rhythmic drum thing to generate this. And just in expressing yourself that way, right? Triggering samples or playing drums or manipulating bass frequencies or melody. Or even if you're recording guitar, bass, or if it's a real instrument, it's like having your effect pedals, right? Having your different ways, your different amp channels to then change how you're vibing out on a part in real time, right? And I can't express how important this step is. So I hope this video inspired you. I hope it helped you see how you can start generating ideas and finish songs more quickly, have fun with it. And it's really the foundational work that will allow you to finish songs and be connected to the process, right? Instead of being too analytical and thinking too much about it, you're more so expressing yourself and having fun. And that's going to generate the ideas in which you'll build your song structure from. So if you have any questions or if there's any other content you would like to see in the future, please leave a comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, download that free PDF at metamindmusic.com/workflow, or you can find it in the description below. And this is the first step of that workflow process. So if you print it out, you'll be able to follow this process that I've showed you, and then you can then hop on and continue throughout the next phases and get your song finished. And until next time, we'll talk to you soon.